Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the first part of the novel Women of Light. The author is Callie Fajardo-Anstein. She's a Denver native and received her bachelor's degree at Metro State University, and she received her MFA in creative writing from the University of Wyoming. Her short story collection, Sabrina and Corina, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and this was her first publication that really launched her career as a published writer. The novel is set in two different time periods and locations: 1860s Lost Territory of Colorado, which refers to the northern New Mexico and southern Colorado lands, and 1930s Depression-era Denver. In an interview, she shared that many of the characters are based on some of her own ancestors whose stories she grew up hearing, particularly the stories of the women in her family. Another significant aspect of this novel, and why I wanted to assign it to this course, is that it portrays the lives of Chicano indigenous populations in this region, the generations of Spanish Mexican individuals who mixed with the local indigenous population over hundreds of years ago, and who therefore do not fit into the imagery of the immigrant Mexican. They thus have a historical claim to the land and therefore to belonging, particularly in this region. I also thought about how this novel is a good portrayal of the decolonial history that Emma Perez was talking about in her article. She tells the history from the perspective of generations of women, which was something that Perez called for as a way to decolonize history. It focuses on the history of Chicana indigenous lesbians through Maria Josie, so it represents also sexuality, and focuses on historical events such as the Great Depression from a race, class, and gender perspective. And it also juxtaposes the storytelling of indigenous and Chicanos of the region against the storytelling of Anglos. And you see that expressed here in this quote about Pidre, where it says, Pidre came from storytelling people, but as he passed the big top devoted to the reenactment of Custer's last stand, he couldn't help but think that Anglos were perhaps the most dangerous storytellers of all, for they believed only their own words, and they allowed their stories to trample the truths of nearly every other man on earth. So through these kinds of representations and through this kind of thinking, right, observation from Pidre in relationship to how the Anglos are telling stories, the author in a way represents decolonial history because she is including a critique of how Anglos tell stories versus how the people in the region tell their stories. Early on, we see a very disturbing scene here of Diego getting beaten. And I wanted to highlight this particular scene because of all the different layers that it represents, all the different issues that the author is able to touch upon just from this particular experience that Diego has. So one is, of course, racialized violence, where white men beat Diego in response to his relationship with Eleanor, who's a white woman. There's also a violence used to displace Chicanos from their homes, right? Diego is eventually asked to leave by his aunt. And this is her way of not just protecting him from a future encounter that might cost him his life, but also a way to protect her and Luz, because they also become targets just from being related to Diego. She also touches on systemic racism in the criminal justice system, as seen in how he himself, right, and the family members don't see a sense at all in calling the police. They actually believe that some of the men that were involved in the beating were probably police officers themselves. And we also see the role of women in relationship to violence. You can see sort of the sense that violence is something that is expected that the men in the family are going to experience in one way or another, and that the role of women is to patch them back up, right? To have the resilience and strength to be able to deal with the violence that the men and their families are going to experience, and to be able to put them back together. You really see this in this quote from Teresita, when she's patching up Diego and says to Luz, "Better get used to it, mija. Soon you will be a wife and a mother. They blow themselves up in mines, shatter bones with gears, crush their faces with rocks. Who do you think fixes all that?" Right. So you also really see sort of a gendered difference here on how these kinds of experiences of racialized violence impact men and women differently. And we also see how the characters, the Latinx characters, relate to the white characters in the novel. And it really represents sort of these racialized dynamics of this time period between white people in Denver and the Latinx population. So, of course, you have Eleanor Ann represents white women who need to be protected from quote unquote other men. And you definitely see that in how her white male family members respond to Diego and treat him. You also see this sort of juxtaposition of the Latinx population being the ones who are native to the region, and whites are not. For example, Eleanor Ann exchanges with Luz that she's from Missouri. You also have the Ticas family, so representing other white ethnic immigrant populations that had moved and settled in this area. You also see sort of demarcations of space in the city, where spaces of whiteness include places like the Park Hill neighborhood, and you really see the differences there from when Luz and Lisette are going into the neighborhood to pick up laundry, right? But you also see sort of this process of how white ethnics become white, how they get accepted into whiteness, mainstream whiteness, through the representation of the Greek American family, where they're white, but they're not white enough yet, right? So you see the Ticas family, right, and Papa Ticas being open to all the different neighbors in the family. They come and shop at his market. He doesn't have any problem with them. But you also see sort of the son who's now been, experienced elite education in the East Coast. He's a lawyer, right? So sort of how he's sort of navigating in a way, on the one hand, the ethnic background that he has from his father being Greek, but also wanting to be able to participate in mainstream whiteness. In flashbacks to the 1920s, we see Diego and Luz living in a mining camp in the Lost Territory with their parents. And we see sort of that part in the book where she represents how the father, right, abandoned the family and how violent he was with the family. But you also get a sense of sort of how they were living in this mining camp. And so the book really does a good job at representing the mining work in this time period. Mining was a significant source of labor and wealth in the state. And it's interesting that she decides to call the Greek father Ticas, because Ticas was the name of Louis Ticas was the name of a leader of the coal miners union who was killed during the famous Lolo massacre. And you might have heard of the Lolo massacre in your history courses. And this was a horrible incident that took place in southern Colorado, where the miners had been in an ongoing strike, almost all-out war with their employers for about a year. And this culminates in the massacre, where the family members, women and children, were killed. And they were living in a tent colony at this point. Literally tents is where they were living in. And this was as a result of the mining company kicking them out of the mining camp when they started striking. So they had to leave their homes and basically create these spaces where they could live. But then it meant that they were very vulnerable to the violence of the mining company, the Colorado National Guard, the police in the area, they were all pretty much there not to protect the people, but to protect the mining company. And so this escalates, this tension escalates to the point to where this massacre takes place. And here in the image, you see what's left at the end of this incident, where the tents are set on fire, and there are women and children that are trapped in these tents, and thus end up dying. And among the dead, a lot of times you see the Lolo massacre talked about, there's documentaries about it and so on, but it tends to focus on the white workers, and rarely is it mentioned that Mexican Americans were also there. And among the dead was a 3-month-old Mexican American baby. So she's really drawing from the history, right, of this time period and of this region, and incorporating that into many of her characters. We also see another historical event that it's alluded to, where Luz has a vision of Anglo body snatchers in California, and Abel, her boyfriend, tells her the story of repatriation. And this is a moment in the 1930s when Mexican Americans become scapegoats for the Depression. And so as the economic situation worsens, there's a rise in repatriation movements, some which were voluntary, some which were forced. And it was basically where Mexican Americans throughout the Southwest were experienced raids in their workplaces, in their homes, and were gathered and forcibly removed from the US to Mexico. Now, many of these individuals that were forcibly repatriated, many of them were American citizens. And so about 60% of the population that was repatriated was actually American citizens. So this is sort of a dark moment in history, in Mexican American history, and their experience in the US, where their citizenship did not protect them at all. It just mattered that they were Mexican. Mexicans were the ones that were being blamed for the economic situation, for the lack of jobs for Anglos. And so this became the response. And it's a legal response by the government. Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1929, which made unlawful entry into the U.S. a felony, and authorizes the U.S. to carry out federal deportation campaign. But again, it wasn't just people who came in illegally, but it was primarily, or the majority of the folks who were moved to Mexico were American citizens. Some on their own, because of the fear of violence, being forcibly removed, decided to leave on their own, which is the part that is listed there as a voluntarily deciding to move to Mexico. But again, it raises a question: how voluntarily was it when they were seeing people disappear literally in their neighborhoods? There's the estimate of how many people were repatriated from the region are between 500,000 and 1 million people. And the image here is of families waiting to board trains to Mexico and Los Angeles in 1932. So she gets this vision, right, of this happening, and doesn't quite understand what it is until Ava, who is from California, and has heard the stories and witnessed some of this, shares with her what this is about. And it increases her concerns about Diego, as Diego is traveling around the region, working in different places. Now, of course, we're going to talk about what the various ways in which the characters in this novel experience unbelonging. And you see different examples throughout the first part. Luz talks about seeing signs designating spaces as whites only, and here's an example of the kinds of signs that you would see in the region during this time period, where it would say no dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans allowed. Could only access certain neighborhoods, as we talked before, like neighborhoods like Park Hill, only as laundresses, right? If they walked through the park, if they walked through the neighborhood, any other time, they were harassed or perceived as suspicious. She also talks about, remembers her childhood experiences in school, particularly Diego's experiences of being punished, physically punished for not speaking English, having to sit in the colored and Spanish section of the streetcar, being excluded from the library when she attempts to go to the library in a different neighborhood, looking for the communal job board, and essentially being told that this is not her community and should go back to her own neighborhood. And you also see her expressing her desire to belong in this quote, "I want to feel in control of my own life now, not someday. I just want to feel safe, like I can do as I please." And so you really get a sense of how trapped, right? The limits that she feels are there, placed on her, and feels like she can't really control her life. We also see this exchange between David and Luz around education, where she shares with him that she only got as far as the 4th grade in the Lost Territory before she moved to Denver. And David assumes that her lack of education has to do with a lack of drive. As you see in his quote here, "It's a shame there isn't a greater drive for smart girls like you to go on in school." And so he assumes that her lack of education has to do with a lack of drive, right? Instead of being able to see it as a systemic problem. Here you see Luz's counter to that, how she thinks of education and how she looks at the women in her family in terms of what they know versus what kind of schooling education you have. As she says, Lisette could sew an entire dress from a pattern she'd glimpsed only once. Teresita could heal someone as good as any doctor. And Maria Josie's physical strength mirrored her abundant and steady mind. And she also recalls all the things that she had to learn on her own in order to survive in the city when she and Diego move here. And so he is completely clueless as to what the limits of education are in this time period for children like herself. And here's and the image is an example of what were the kinds of environments in which Mexican children were receiving schooling. When they talk about Diego and Luz going to school and going to the schoolhouse in the Lost Territory, this is an image of what they were talking about. This is the Mexican schoolhouse that the Maestas family children were being forced to attend in 1914. And in 1914, in Alamosa, Colorado, Francisco Maestas was a Mexican individual, tried to enroll his son Miguel, who was 11 years old, at the school closest to their home in Alamosa, which is a small town in southern Colorado. But school officials insisted that Miguel attend the segregated Mexican school, which is the one pictured here, which required a longer walk across railroad tracks. Maestas submitted a petition with 180 signatures challenging the decision. He was turned down again. So he and other Mexican-American parents pulled their children out of school in protest and boycotted for a couple of months and not sending their children to any school. The parents banded together, raised money for a lawyer, and took their case to court. Parents argued that they were being sent to the Mexican school as racial discrimination, that they were being racially discriminated. The school board argued that it wasn't because of race, because at that time, Mexicans were perceived as white, but because they didn't speak English. But during the trial, the children were brought individually to testify in English, demonstrating that their English was perfectly fine and that the school board was wrong. So the judge decides in favor of the parents and states that the children need to be allowed to go to the nearest school. And so in 1914, this becomes one of the earliest desegregation cases. So of course, we always hear about the Brown versus Board of Education case as the major case that did away with desegregation nationally. But before that case, in individual states, individual towns, counties, and so on throughout the Southwest, Mexican families were fighting against desegregation. And this is one of the earliest cases that we see here in Colorado. So I share this historical moment to sort of contextualize, right, this exchange between David and Luz around education, right? And who gets to have access to education during this time period? That it's not about a desire for education and a drive for education, but what are the ways in which education is not accessible to Mexican American children during this time period. So this ends the lecture for this week. I look forward to your comments in the discussion post. I'm really eager to see what you all think about this first part of Women of Light. I hope you have a wonderful week. Take care.